So tonight, the last thing, I don't think I handed these out. You're fine. Oh, no. The last subject that we had on our 14-week agenda here, I think it was originally 16 weeks, but you remember back in February, I think we missed like 3 Wednesdays because of snow and ice and all kinds of stuff. So this was always going to be our last topic, and the topic for tonight, godly civil leaders. How is it we can find and support godly magistrates? And to start us off, we're going to go to a series of verses that you're familiar with, and that usually get brought up in this context, and that's 2 Chronicles chapter 7, beginning of verse 12 through verse 14. So again, in 2 Chronicles 7, 12 through 14, the kind of context of this, Solomon is establishing his kingdom. He has recently become the king after the death of his father, and we are hearing him again as he is speaking unto the people. So again, 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verse 12. Then the Lord appeared to Solomon by night and said to him, I have heard your prayer and have chosen this place for myself as a house of sacrifice. When I shut up heaven and there is no rain, or command the locusts to devour the land, or send pestilence among the people, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, and I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and heal their land. Now my eyes will be open and my ears attentive to prayer made in this place. Amen. So, it's worthwhile. Again, the context here doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the United States per se, but on the other hand, it does. Because the general principle of 2 Chronicles 7:14 is that a nation which desires to see the blessing of the Lord needs to bless the Lord in the way it behaves, and the words it uses, and the way it acts. And when you're talking about a nation like the United States, we operate in a constitutional republic where we have federal representatives, whether you're talking about state representatives or whether you're talking about national representatives. They are they are federal, right? They represent the local populace. Again, whether we're talking about Mr. Pope, who oversees us in this part of York County, or whether we're talking about Mr. Norman, right, who oversees this part of the state. Do y'all have a different U.S. rep where you are? Yeah. Are you Ralph Norman too? Okay. So, and then of course we have our senators, Mr. Scott and Mr. Lindsay, who represent us in D.C., right? So again, even in a federal republic like we have, the understanding is that if we would like to see our nation be blessed, then we should concern ourselves with who it is that are representing us. Because again, when you think about the nature of our political system, how does somebody get to be a civil magistrate in America? They're elected, right? We don't appoint people. We don't get people in office just because they're the sons or daughters of the people in office, but sometimes it works out that way. We've had at least 2 cases in the history of the United States where a father and a son have both served as president. Anybody, get that Jeopardy question? The Bushes and who else? That's right, the Adams, right? John Adams and John Quincy Adams and George H.W. and George W. Bush, right? They both served. Now, of course, William Henry Harrison and Benjamin Harrison were not father and son, but, they were related. So there's been 3 sets, and if you want to count the Roosevelts, they weren't really related. They were kind of like 3rd or 4th cousins. But for the most part, we've had a history in the United States where, we don't see kind of a monarchy, a king and a queen, being followed by their sons and daughters. So when we think about, again, godly civil magistrates in the United States, the first question we have to ask ourselves is, who is responsible to make sure that we have godly civil magistrates? We are, right? The people are, right? Because we elect those people into office. And so, sometimes you'll hear people reference Thomas Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptists, right, which is supposed to enshrine the separation of church and state in America, right? Now, we need to remind ourselves something about our founding on that front, right? There's a lot of conversation about whether or not we were founded as a Christian nation or whether we are a Christian nation. And in America, it's kind of an odd way to phrase it, because in a sense, we were never set up to be a nation. Right? The idea of America is that we are the United States. Right? The states are supposed to have the power, and the federal government was originally set up just to kind of be the clearinghouse to make sure that the states got along and that the kind of wider borders were protected. It's one of the reasons, obviously, we have the 10 amendments, right? The Bill of Rights. The thing about the U.S. Constitution is that, unlike other national constitutions, it is not telling you what the government is going to do for you. It is telling you what the government is restricted to do. Right? It's a limiting document. Right? So when we think about the United States, when we think about a Christian nation, really what we ought to be asking ourselves is, what about the states when they were put together? Now, we live in South Carolina. Right? South Carolina was founded, anybody remember the year? It's obviously one of the original 13 colonies, right? So technically, when did the state of South Carolina come into effect? Right, 1776, 1789, right? Depending on what year you want to use, right? Now, of course, when you think about South Carolina, we're also reminded that there is, a time when we were separate from the United States, right? From 1861 to 1860 to 1865, right? Because South Carolina was the first state to secede from the Union. Again, just if you're taking notes, the colony of South Carolina was founded in 1663. So we're one of the oldest ones. But right, when you think about our establishment as a colony or as a state, or as we were reestablished in 1865, and then later on when we were really reestablished when Reconstruction ended, and you look at the state constitution of South Carolina, one of the things you're going to notice is that the state's constitution, as originally intended, named Jesus Christ as the head of the state of South Carolina. Now, obviously, when they wrote that, right, Jesus was in heaven. He wasn't literally sitting on a throne in Charleston or in Columbia. Right? We understand that what that means is that the state is grounded upon the wisdom and the sovereign will of the Lord. Now, how does that fit in with something like separation of church and state? Well, the way that the founders of the Federal Republic of the United States understood is that the federal Constitution would not recognize a particular denomination or a particular religion per se, but the states were still free to do so. So multiple U.S. states had an established church well into the 1820s. So even when Jefferson is writing his letter to the Danbury Baptists about separation, on one hand, he's a bit of an outlier. Right? Thomas Jefferson was himself a little bit of an outlier when it came to this, but he would not have understood the modern understanding of separation of church and state. Now, of course, we don't pretend that Thomas Jefferson was a Christian. Right? What's one of the things Jefferson's famous for when it comes to his personal faith? Anybody know? Anybody remember what Jefferson did to his Bible? He took out anything that was supernatural. He cut out the whole Old Testament, and basically just took the teachings of Jesus and copied and pasted them into a Bible. Right? And so he was not a Christian, right? And he didn't pretend to be either, to be fair. But even somebody like Jefferson understood that a country, it's actually better to talk about the United States as a country rather than a nation. But as a country, he understood the United States was founded on the principles of the Christian religion. And so it was a Protestant country. It was a country which recognized that if we desire to be blessed, we must do so in the full wisdom of the Lord. And of course, many states had a religious test in order to serve in office, well past the 1789 Constitution. And, some of those tests could have been simply, do you believe God exists? And you would have had to check a mark in order to file for office. Some of them were more rigorous. Some states require that you be a member of the established church in that particular state if you wanted to run for office. So when we think about stuff like that, right, and we think about, again, the culture we live in today, the idea of a religious test really hasn't gone away. It's just a matter of which religion gets to establish itself and which religion gets to bring that test to bear. Right? So, for example, right, if you were trying to run for senator in Massachusetts, right, what kind of religion do you think you better hold to if you want to be brought into office? Well, we don't think about it in this way, right? But you have to hold to tenets, the kind of the requirements of the liberal faith, right? You have to be pro-abortion, right? You have to be pro-gay marriage. You have to be, in favor of certain, ideas, right? And so there is, in a sense, a religious test still going on. We don't call it that. We may not think of it that way. But when we consider it in that direction, right? And we think about again what 2 Chronicles 7:14 says. If we want godly rulers in our country, right, it has to begin where? In the home, right? A lot of what we talked about in the 14 weeks that we've covered topics has to do with the home, right? Because it is very much the building block of society, right? It's the building block of culture. It's the building block of the local town, the local city, the local whatever, right? When we think about, and again, this is not as true as it used to be, partly because of the way the media operates now. But if you wanted to one day be president of the United States, where did you need to start? Yeah, well, your local council or whatever, right? You go back and you look at, most presidents prior to the invention of the television, and they almost all started out, city council, and then moved up to some kind of state government, and moved up to be a governor, right? That was one of the big things when Barack Obama was elected, is that was the first time a U.S. senator had been elected president since John F. Kennedy. And, John F. Kennedy was the first senator to be elected in ever, right? That was not normally how you became a president. But since Obama, where has everybody come from? Well, Joe Biden was a senator and vice president. Obviously, Trump didn't hold any office, right? I guess you can say he was president this time, but, right, he did not work his way up the ladder, right? Some of that comes from the primary system and kind of how that's set up. But so when we think about again that kind of federal level office, right? It's a much more difficult thing to do to change the entire culture of the United States in order to affect the federal office, right? So generally speaking, what level of government do you think we should spend most of our time concerned with?
It should be state.
Right, state, county, town, right? Because what is really going to be affecting you day to day? Yeah, certainly the federal is going to affect you, but you know, if you live in the city of Clover, right, what's going to affect your most of your time? It's going to be the city council. It's going to be the mayor. It's going to be, county council. And especially, things are different in West Virginia, but, which of kind of the, local boards do you think is probably the most important one to make sure that we have godly rulers in? Of all the local boards and things of that nature. Well, yeah. Think about what's across the street.
School board.
Yeah. School board is going to be the most important of all of the boards, right? Because, even again, operating in this world of separation of church and state, which we don't necessarily believe in, but, the vast majority of people in your local school district are not going to be raised in Christian homes right now, right? And so, if you want to affect change in your local community, what do you think is the most important place to regulate and make sure that they are being taught, in a way that comports with biblical morality, with biblical law, with biblical understanding of mankind, all that stuff, right? It's going to be the school board, right? So in one sense, when we talk about civil magistrates, it's good to talk about the president, right? Because that's the flashiest job out there. But generally speaking, you're not going to change much about who the president is unless you're a billionaire and can get somebody's ear, right? The most effectual change that you can see is going to be at the local level, whether you're talking about city council if you live in town, right, or county commission if you live out in the country. How are things set up in Cherokee County? Do y'all have like a county council? And I mean, that's
I think basically the mayors and then
right.
your city councils and your county councils.
Mm-hmm.
I think what
I mean,
school board.
right, and the school board. Now, are they split up in
Yeah,
Cherokee?
we only have two representatives on this side of the river.
Okay, so in Cherokee, there's one board over the county.
Yeah.
Okay, right, because in Clover, that in York County, that's split up.
Yeah,
There's
I know
different.
They have at-large
Right.
people too. I think in Clover, don't they?
Yeah, and so.
Then at-large.
And obviously, if you look at a county map of York County, obviously where we are out here, it's kind of like being in one of those big western states, right? You have a huge area, but you don't have near the population that, like Wiley does or whatever, right? So you can feel as if you're already outnumbered before you even get there, right?
We definitely are.
And so, but again, thinking about the what the Bible has to say again about this, right? If we want civil magistrates who are godly and who support the crown rights of King Jesus and all that, right? Not only does it begin in the home, but it also begins in the training of future leaders, right? We can think about the schools, right? That's obviously the most direct way, right? Obviously, my kids aren't in the public schools, so this is me asking out of ignorance. But how much civics gets taught nowadays in public schools?
We used to have some
Unless they take civics, don't get none
Mm.
Because that was.
Right, it's not a required course anymore.
It was when I was in.
Right. Yeah. It was a second 9 weeks class when I was in high school. So the first 9 weeks we did like the political history of the United States or something like that, and then the second 9 weeks was like just straight up. This is what this does, and this is what that does, and this is how a bill is made, and all that kind of stuff. So obviously, if you want to affect change generationally, it certainly begins in the home, but it also, of course, begins in the schools, making sure that not only are the kids taught these things, but it's not even so much nuts and bolts stuff, right? Part of teaching history, for example, is teaching how we got the principles that we had, right? I know he's not popular nowadays, but South Carolina's most famous son for most of its history was John C. Calhoun, right? And if you want to read them, I got them. I got about 5 or 6 books that John C. Calhoun wrote on political economy, right? On politics, on all that kind of stuff, right? And to this day, a lot of how the Senate operates, a lot of how our judicial branch operates is built on stuff that John C. Calhoun said 170 years ago, right? So part, again, of building up godly civil magistrates is making sure that our children and even us, no matter how old we are, understands the nature of our system, right? Because I think a lot of the problems we have nowadays is people are just completely ignorant about how the system operates, about why we do certain things and how we do certain things. And so, often when people are ignorant of how things work, what do they get when they don't see things happening? They get frustrated, get angry, get anxious, right? When often the solution is pretty clear, right? But if you're ignorant of the history, if you're ignorant of the principles, you're ignorant of how we as a culture organize things. I'm a big supporter of the idea that there's a particular Southern way of looking at political economy and understanding in the nature of the responsibility of the federal government. There's a famous saying after the war that really what Abraham Lincoln did was change us from these United States to the United States, right? The change from this being a bond of states to being from a pure plural to a singular, right? In a sense, after Lincoln, we go from being a country to a nation, right? And one of the effects of that, of course, is we start getting involved in foreign wars, right? We start getting involved in imperial adventures all over the place. We get the Philippines and Hawaii and all kinds of stuff, right? We got in a war with Spain in 1898, primarily because we were gallivanting around the Caribbean where we shouldn't have been, and the USS Maine got blown up, right, in the harbor, right? And William McKinley brought us into war, right? So, there's a conception, again, of the role and responsibility of a nation in general, right, that's informed from the scriptures, right?
Too. I think when people don't, like with the ignorance, they're led astray.
Right.
So often they'll just accept what they're told.
Right.
Kind of what goes on now, they
right.
just accept false to be true.
Well, and when you have a kind of purely national view of politics, for example, right, is one, it makes it hard to find qualified people to take care of things locally, because everybody's focused on Washington, D.C., that they forget about Clover or Blacksburg or Gaffney, right? And so you end up not having qualified people running local government, and so you end up with all kinds of problems because all the money, all the attention is focused on something that we don't really have a hand in some ways, right? But I mean, when we think of, again, the scriptures, the way that civil government and the civil magistrates are supposed to operate, right? If you look at Israel as an example, right? And I don't think there's anything wrong with looking at Israel as an example of a godly, nation, because it was for times in its history. One of the things that God tells Israel is to be content with the bounds that He gave them, right? And what happens every time Israel goes outside the boundaries that God gave them? They end up in war and destruction and losing what they had, right? And the history of the United States in the last 130 years is all bound up in getting involved in things that probably wasn't our business, right? Getting involved in foreign wars that, in some ways destroyed the culture that we had, right? I think about this, especially in Europe. Obviously I'm a firm believer that the First and Second World War was God's judgment on Europe for their abandoning of the faith in the 19th century. But one of the reasons why World War I happens is because you have entangling alliances, right? That was one of the things that the founders of the United States warned us about. George Washington especially warned us about getting in alliances with foreign countries, because if you're going to make a vow to another country to defend it in a time of attack, what do you got to do when they get attacked, right? So the founders were like, look, stay out of Europe. Don't get involved over there. Them people, can't get along. We're separated by a giant ocean. We're fine over here. We got everything we need. But First World War happens, right? Because, there's an alliance between Austria-Hungary and this country, and then this country and gets involved with this country, and that country had an alliance with Russia, and this country had an alliance with France, and this country had an alliance with the United Kingdom, and next thing you know, war breaks out, millions of people get killed, and not only do you see millions of people get killed, but you see all the seeds sown for what comes 20 years later, when Hitler rises to power, when Mussolini comes to power, when Churchill comes to power, when Stalin comes to power, right? All these big men come to power, and big men like to fight each other, right? So, and part of the reason why you have these big men fighting each other is because you have generations of people who have been let down by their civil governments, right? And so they're looking for a strong man, right? They're looking for a man to fix it right now, right? And of course, those are the promises that Hitler and Mussolini and Stalin and those guys were making, that they were going to fix everything and bring back the nation to its former glory. Right? That was one of the big cries. Well, if you give yourself a big army, you have an itch to use it, right? So Hitler wanted to take back all of the German lands that had been lost in the First World War, invades Poland and the Low Countries, France, all that, right? Next thing you know, conflagration, tens of millions of people are dead now, right? And we sit and we wonder, well, what happened to Europe, right? Why is Europe in a position where it's having to import all of these foreign nationals from the Middle East and from Pakistan? Well, if you take 2 seconds and think about it, if you lose millions of men, who's there to do the work, right? Right? And so Europe has the other problem that the United States now shares, right? There is barely a nation on earth that has a positive replacement rate when it comes to having children, right? I mean, nations like South Korea are going to literally not exist in 100 years. The replacement rate is so low. And China, and India, continue to go up, but even they have started to plateau a little bit. China's actually starting to lose numbers because people aren't having kids anymore. And of course, a lot of that is because of their policies, which, kind of force people not to have children, right? Now, we think about, again, all this history, all this kind of political geography and stuff like that, and we think about a godly magistrate, right? We think about a godly civil government, right? Well, obviously a wicked government is going to get people killed. It's going to get you in wars you don't need to be in. It's going to cause destruction and all that stuff, right? That's the witness of the Old Testament, right? When Israel and Judah have a godly leader, right? What happens to Judah and Israel? They receive blessings. There's harmony. There's peace in the land. God gives them victories over their enemies. All of these things take place. So again, it does come back again to this humbling of the civil magistrate under the sovereignty of God, under His command. And of course, one of the things we believe as ARPs is we believe in a doctrine called social covenanting. Now, what that looks like historically is that, of course, the Associate Presbytery and the Reformed Presbytery, who became ARP back in 1782, right? The Associates, Ebenezer Erskine and all those guys, they believed that the covenants that they had made with the nation of Scotland had made with God in 1638 and 1643 were still applicable today to the nation. And part of the reason why God was judging Scotland in those days was because they had forsaken those covenants, right? So when I say social covenanting, I mean the government covenanting with God by way of a written document that they sign and that they promise not just to be obedient to God, but to promote God, right? And so when we think of a civil magistrate, right, one of the ways the Bible looks at a civil magistrate, for example, in Romans 13, the famous passage that speaks on this, we see in Romans 13 that if we do what is good, we will have praise from the same. Right? That the civil magistrate is there to put into practice the law of God and to direct the people in order that they might know what is good and what is bad. And of course, who gets to set the definition of what's good and what's bad? God does, right? Because God alone is good, and anything that is against God is bad, right? So in a godly country with a godly magistrate, we should expect, for instance, there to be Sabbath laws, right? Now, I'm sure y'all remember a time when there were Sabbath laws. They didn't repeal the blue laws in West Virginia until like 1990. I can remember as an older kid that there was nothing open on Sundays because it was against the law to open on Sundays, right? There were certain things allowed to be open on Sundays, but for the vast majority, like the mall was closed on Sunday. Most stores were closed on Sunday. I think the only thing that was allowed to be open were grocery stores. I think was the only thing. And so you think about that, right? That's just an application of the fourth commandment, right? Because what are you supposed to be doing on Sunday? You're supposed to be resting and going to church, right? Can you go to church if your business is open? No, right? So the idea, again, of a godly civil magistrate is not only is he enforcing the fourth commandment, but obviously he's enforcing the sixth commandment, seventh commandment, eighth commandment, ninth commandment, fifth commandment, third commandment, second commandment, first commandment, right? He's encouraging his people, right, to do these things in order that they might be blessed, right? Because that's the other aspect of a godly civil magistrate that is important to think about, right? Because the desire of a godly civil magistrate is to be a servant, but also to be a shepherd, right? They're a servant of God, right? The Romans 13 uses the word minister. Interestingly enough, the word minister that's translated minister in Hebrews 13 or Romans 13 is the same word we use elsewhere for deacon. A deacon is a service, office where you make sure everybody has what they need, whether we're talking physical things or spiritual things. And so part of the role and responsibility of a godly civil magistrate is make people have the opportunity to go to church, right? Now, in older days, that meant who paid the bills in a local church? A civil magistrate did, right? The church didn't pay its light bill. It didn't even pay the minister. The local church was I don't want to say a ward of the state. That's wrong to say that, but the idea is that you think about what do you think replaced the church in the state? If back in the day, never in the United States, but back in Europe, this is still the case in some places, but what replaces the church, do you think, in a godless nation? Well, the government does. That's exactly right? So the function of the government really hasn't changed. It just changes who the priests, so to speak, of the government are, right? If you have a problem, of a spiritual nature, of course they wouldn't call it that, but if you have a problem of spiritual nature in a godless country, who do you go to see? You go see the psychiatrist, right? You go see a psychologist, you go see a social worker, you go see somebody who's been trained to help you navigate, what we would call sin, right? What they would call poor decision making. And so, there's nothing wrong, obviously, being a social worker or anything, but, in a godly commonwealth with a godly civil magistrate, who would you go see in those situations? The pastor, right? And you also, back in those days, right, the way that churches were kind of apportioned is that they had a parish, right? So have you ever been to England? England, I've never been there, but everybody who's been there tells me, if you drive around, right, what do you see everywhere? Churches, right? Well, you would have like the main cathedral in town, right? And then you would have what they call chapels of ease, out in the countryside, right? So if you lived out in the countryside, you would go to church on Sunday at your chapel of ease, right? The vicar would be there, right? Cute little English fella, right? Would be there, right? And you would use the cathedral for weddings and funerals, right? For kind of big things, right? Where the bishop was, right? But the idea is that the civil government was helping out the spiritual state of the nation by ensuring that there were churches taking care of everybody, whether you were a Christian or not, taking care of everybody in a local area, right? So, in that scenario, the deacons would very much be in charge of taking care of everybody in the parish, right? Making sure that everybody in the parish was fed, clothed, watered, had what they needed, right? That's what a godly civil government looks like, right? Because a godly civil government understands that as much as it's good to have, civil servants willing to help people out, what is the need that most people have? It's a spiritual need, right? It's a spiritual lostness, right? It's a gospel need that they have, right? So the primary agent of a godly civil magistrate in dealing with kind of social problems is the church, which God has uniquely enabled to deal with those kind of things. Now, obviously, the state also has a responsibility to bear the sword, right? So it's not the church's responsibility to take down murderers, right? That's the state's job. But the church, of course, has a role to play in that godly civil magistrate, right? So, as we kind of come to a close tonight, as we think about this, the question, we have to ask ourselves again as we think about how to have godly civil leaders, right? What's the first thing do you think we need to do if we want to have godly civil leaders?
You need to do something about the person.
Right? That's certainly part of it, right? You need to really check in to make sure that these people who are running for office are godly, who are interested in the things of the Lord, right? Now, does God sometimes give us unbiblical leaders who do good things? Sure, right? We've been going through Ezra and Nehemiah on Sunday morning, right? Those two books are nothing but an example of a godless civil magistrate who helps out the church, right? Artaxerxes and Cyrus and all those guys. So certainly, doing due diligence. What's that?
I said the Lord can use them.
That's right. Lord can use them too, and He does all the time, right? But what's the primary thing we need to be doing?
Pray.
To pray, right? That's what the Apostle Paul tells Timothy in 1 Timothy 2, right? Pray for the civil magistrate, pray for the king, that you might live peaceably, right? We live in a very, very spiritually poor time, in a very spiritually weak time. And one of the ways that it shows itself is the fact that people don't gather to pray, right? Because we don't believe, this is just me talking, but we don't believe in the power of prayer anymore, right? We've become thoroughly atheistic on that front, right? Prayer is the lifeblood of the Christian, right? I heard somebody say that one time, right? Prayer is the foundation of our faith, right? Jesus tells us what can prayer do? It can move mountains, right? Now, do we believe that? I don't think we do because we don't show it, right? We don't gather to pray like we should, right? We don't, spend the time praying that we should. So it shouldn't surprise us, right, that we don't have godly civil leaders, because we kind of hope for that, but we don't put the effort in to really doing what's necessary. So again, identifying godly men, encouraging them to run for office is certainly part of that, right? Some people are gifted towards civil leadership, right? And it's worthwhile for the church to identify those kind of people and encourage them towards that, right? It used to be a wonderful thing to open yourself up for civil service, right? But what do most people seek nowadays when they want to get involved in government? What's in it for them, right? Fame, all that kind of stuff. This might get me in trouble, but
Get rich quick.
get rich quick, right? I mean, how many times do we see that kind of stuff marked out where a politician enters at this income level and by the time they're done, they're multimillionaires, right? I mean, I think a good example of this, in a judgment way, is some of the women who are in the U.S. Congress right now, especially on the Republican side. Right. I'm especially thinking of the lady down in the 1st Congressional District in South Carolina. I mean, she's an abhorrent person. Nancy Mace. She is. It's just, and it gets worse. Her kind of self-promotion with her body and things of that nature. We have other ladies. Thinking of that lady in Georgia, and then the one out in Colorado. Who are ungodly women, right? And you start looking at the people in charge of the United States right now, and the men aren't any better, right? It used to be, right, that scandals would drive men from office, right? Does anybody even care anymore if there's a scandal of some kind of moral kind?
It don't seem like it.
One of the most abhorrent things that has ever happened in the history of the United States is being uncovered right now. And I don't really care whether Joe Biden's a Democrat or Republican. It doesn't matter. What they've done to that man is just abhorrent. Not only did they knowingly push him forward with dementia to be in charge of 3,700 nuclear warheads, but all the evidence I've seen in the last week or so says that they legitimately neglected his cancer. Yeah. That they knew he had cancer and did nothing about it. And it's abhorrent behavior. But when you think about it, would it surprise you for the Republicans to do the same thing? We would hope it would be different, but I think we're in a position right now where in the scheme of things, right, I certainly think we would rather have one side in charge than the other. But it just seems to me the more things become, one of the blessings of the internet is we just become more aware of some of these things. Now, I certainly think we had more godly leaders in the past. But in one sense, we were kind of shielded from it just because we didn't know them as well as we know them now. And also, one of the dangers of social media is that you post things without thinking, right? And some people post things on purpose to get a reaction. Right? That's their only goal is to, on the Republican side to own the libs, or on the Democrat side to virtue signal, right? Is that really what we should be seeking in godly civil magistrates? People who are in it for themselves, in it for promotion, in it for money, in it for all that stuff, right? Because you look back at a nation like Rome, right? As Edward Gibbon, the English historian said, Rome did not fall from the outside, right? Rome fell from the inside. It basically rotted out like a tree. And that all started when, and again, they were ungodly in kind of the general sense, right? But, you look back at the rulers from like Julius Caesar, up to Claudius, and those were men of conviction, men of moral character, who sought to serve Rome and all that kind of stuff, right? Who believed in the doctrine of Rome or whatever, right? And then you start getting guys like Caligula and Nero who use their position for all kinds of licentiousness and evil. And next thing you know, the barbarians are at the gates, right? And I think we're in a position right now in the United States where, the barbarians are at the gates and we're rotting from the inside out.
See, evil is good and good is evil.
That's right. I mean, it's... there was a law passed here recently in Colorado, which you probably heard of, which makes it illegal for church camps to discriminate against transgenders, which makes it impossible to operate a Christian camp, which is the point, right? Those people don't care about transgenders. They're using transgenders as a weapon to attack the church, right? It's like that poor guy who bakes cakes out there. Does anybody actually want a cake from him? No. They just want to run them out of business, right? So there's a destructive nature to it, right? And again, part of that is God's judgment upon us as a nation because of our wickedness, of our evil, of our sin, right? You think about the United States since the Second World War, right? And, what have y'all experienced since you were little kids? Do you even recognize the country you live in? It's just, I'm not that old, right?
But just the acceptance of things, there's just seems to be no common sense anymore. It's just, they just accept things as being good.
Yeah, well, there's no long-term thought.
There's no absolute truth.
Right, no truth. Everyone is a king in their own eyes. And all that kind of stuff. One of the ways in which I was talking with a buddy of mine the other night about this. One of the ways you see the moral decline in the United States is in the way everybody dresses. There's a lack of concern of self-respect, of self-worth, right? Everybody likes to laugh and joke about people wearing pajamas to Walmart and stuff, right? Where does that come from, right? One, it's lack of raising, right? That's part of it. The other is its lack of care, of concern about yourself and how you look to others, right? I get made fun of sometimes because I'm like the last ARP minister who wears a tie every day. But I take it all in good fun. But there's an idea, right, that if you have a certain position in the world, then you should represent yourself well in that, right? That you should present yourself in a certain way, right? One of the ways this shows up in the military, for example, is that when I was in the Marines, it was strictly verboten to wear your camouflage uniforms unless you were actively engaged in some kind of camo needing activity, right? If you were on a hump or you were, doing training of some kind. If you weren't in training and you weren't doing that, then you better have your service uniforms on, right? But now, when you look and see people in the military, everybody's wearing their camis everywhere, right? So there's a lack of decorum, a lack of understanding of place, right? A lack of all that stuff. And again, that's a moral problem, right? Because once you deny humanity and once you denigrate humanity, right, why should I care what I look like? Right? Why should it matter
You should sit at school sometimes. I watch them as they come out from the school, like the high school, not just the high school, but the other groups too. They're in slidey shoes. They look like they just rolled out of bed.
Right.
And when we were at school, we tried to look our very best. And,
and I'm sure, and I'm sure there were standards too that y'all had to meet.
You wore your good clothes to school,
right.
and you got home and put your play clothes on.
That's right. That was always a big thing, right? When I was a kid, in August, because school didn't start until like September, but in August, Mom would take us to the shoe store. We would get our school shoes for the year, and if I was caught, well, I had 3 pairs of shoes when I was a kid. I had outside shoes, church shoes, and school shoes. And if I was wearing them school shoes, and well, see, that's something I was, I was listening to a podcast the other day where they were talking about modern home development, right? And if you watch those shows on TV, right, what's the color of everybody's kitchen? It's off-white and grays, right? But there's a moral thing going on there, right? You look at, people like to make fun in the 1970s, right, when everything was avocado green and all that, and orange and wood paneling and stuff. But there was character to things, right? Because again, there was this, just idea of,
It's who the fathers, you think.
Right.
What father would let their daughter, and I guess guess it's an absence or no care,
Right.
care.
Sure. There's a
Or
there's a sexualization going on there too.
that they just let their daughters go out in anything.
Right.
Or you see
Yeah.
that with prom dresses
Oh, very much so.
and you just think, Sarah and I were just
Mm-hmm.
gassed at some of the prom dresses. I guess it was last year. They were like these little teeny weeny cocktail dresses.
Oh, yeah.
And you think, what daddy
Uh-huh.
would allow their daughter to go?
Well, I mean, you kind of answer your own question.
Yeah.
I mean, that's,
There is no dad.
well, again, I mean, a lot of them don't have fathers. And if they do, they're absentee. Or they don't care.
Or, I think they think that, well, they're of this age and they can decide what
Right.
they want to do.
Well, I mean,
That's a lot.
there's a lot of the permissive parenting and stuff like that.
It's easier just to let them do what they
Right.
want to do.
Because you don't have to be their enemy if you just let them do what they want. Then they'll be your friend, right? Is that how that works?
Children,
Yeah. All right. So again, a lot of that, of course, rolls downhill from the civil magistrate, right? One of the things that annoys me about the president of Ukraine is every time you see him, how is he dressed? He looks like a slob.
We're just like Fetterman.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you think about that, right?
Kind of disrespectful.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So, civil magistrates have always been held up in the scriptures as an example to the nation, right? That's why they're judged more harshly, right? Because people look up and see what's expected of them as a citizen from the civil magistrate. So if we have ungodly, wicked civil magistrates, it shouldn't surprise us that we have a wicked and ungodly culture.
They'll